Really hurtful for the family, as I understand it, but they were particularly worried about the kids finding out that way.
For 7 long minutes, the palace gates stood still, frozen in time. The world waited, breaths held tight, as Princess Catherine stepped forward. Not as the Duchess, not as the flawless royal image everyone knew, but as a trembling mother, ready to break centuries of silence. Her words, raw, unfiltered, and heartbreaking, would soon send shockwaves through the monarchy, bringing even Prince William to his knees. The silence, before she spoke, felt like history itself had paused. But before we dive deeper into what this means for the royal family, make sure you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Outside Kensington Palace, the air was thick with unease. Something about this moment felt different, heavier. Reporters who had camped outside for days sensed that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The sound of cameras faded to a hush as Catherine appeared not from the balcony, where she was usually framed in elegance and grace, but through the main gates, alone. No escort, no smile, just a quiet defiance that carried more power than any royal title. Her posture was fragile, yet unyielding. You could see the weight of her secret in every step. Palace aides whispered in panic, unsure whether to intervene. But before anyone could move, she was already standing before the microphones. No royal crest behind her, no carefully arranged backdrop, only the cold stone of Kensington and the raw honesty of her presence. Her trembling hands revealed a war within, between loyalty and love, between duty and truth. She lifted her eyes to the cameras, and for one heartbeat, the world stopped. This was not ceremony. This was rebellion born out of heartbreak. The press, so used to scripted royal events, quickly realized this was something far more dangerous. Catherine wasn't speaking as a duchess. She was speaking as a mother pushed to her breaking point. Behind her, the windows of the royal nursery stood silent. For years, those windows had framed perfect family moments, the smiles of George, Charlotte, and Louis. But now, they looked down, like witnesses to a mother's pain. Catherine's gaze flickered toward them, her lips tightening as if she were drawing courage from her children's laughter. The tension was unbearable. No one knew what she would say, but everyone sensed one thing once she spoke: there would be no going back. The palace staff nearby exchanged nervous glances. The usual royal order, the polished statements, the practiced restraint was gone. In its place stood a woman ready to tear open the truth with her own voice. Those closest to her saw the glimmer in her eyes, not of weakness, but of fierce determination. Every passing second of silence felt like an eternity. Something irreversible was about to happen. Then Catherine took a trembling breath. The murmurs faded into a deep, uneasy quiet, so deep it felt wrong to even breathe. She was no longer just a symbol in the crown story. In that moment, she was every mother fighting to protect her child from forces too powerful to see. The world waited. Her lips parted. The monarchy, centuries old, unshakable, held its breath. And then she spoke. Her voice trembled like a storm breaking through silence. She had no notes, no script. Every word came straight from the heart, a mother's heart pushed beyond its limit. The palace had trained her to smile through everything. But not this time. Her words tore through the illusion, revealing the unbearable truth about the price her children had paid for their birthright. The silence that followed her first sentence was haunting. For years, Catherine had been the symbol of calm, grace, and restraint. She carried the burdens of the crown with quiet endurance, protecting her family from endless scrutiny. But the cost of that silence, it had been destroying her. And now, that pain poured out with every syllable. Her voice shook only when emotion broke through royal discipline. She wasn't speaking to reporters. She wasn't speaking for the monarchy. She was speaking to the world, to parents who understood that no privilege could protect a child from pain. She confessed that her silence had been suffocating. Every statement crafted by palace aides had felt like a betrayal of her children's truth. "My silence," she whispered, "was killing me more than any scandal ever could." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. This was no press event. It was an emotional reckoning. Her composure cracked. just enough for the world to see the pain behind the poise. It was the voice of a woman no longer willing to let her children carry the weight of royal perfection. Catherine spoke of George, Charlotte, and Louis, not as heirs, but as children crushed beneath expectations they never chose. Behind the public, smiles were moments of exhaustion and quiet tears. Laughter, that once filled their halls, had grown faint, swallowed by the demands of duty. "They are just children," she said softly. "Yet they live every day in the shadow of what they are meant to become." Each word struck like a truth the monarchy had long hidden, that royal titles may shine, but they steal something precious in return. Her tone hardened. The monarchy's obsession with perfection, she said, had turned her family into a spectacle. Every act of love was analyzed, every stumble magnified, every glance misinterpreted. Her children's lives had become headlines, their childhood scripted by a system that cared more about image than innocence. It wasn't just the press she blamed, it was the institution itself, the very system that had traded her children's privacy for the illusion of royal mystique. She paused, her breath trembling. "No crown," she declared, "is worth a child's peace of mind." The words thundered through the silence. This was no statement, it was rebellion. A mother's uprising against centuries of royal tradition that placed duty above humanity. The audience stood frozen, some in tears, others too stunned to move. For the first time, the world saw Catherine not as a princess wrapped in privilege, but as a mother, standing alone against an empire built on silence. Her voice shook the foundations of the palace itself. For years, the public believed the royal nursery was a dream, laughter, games, and innocence behind castle walls. But Catherine shattered that illusion. What she described wasn't a fairy tale. It was a gilded cage. The smiles were staged, the moments rehearsed. Behind every photograph was a tear the world never saw. And what came next was even darker. Behind the grand walls of Kensington and Windsor, where the world imagined happy children, a different truth existed. The royal nursery, once painted as a sanctuary, had become a place of quiet control. Every minute of George, Charlotte, and Louis's day was planned. Their studies, their walks, even their words. Tutors came and went, each sworn to secrecy. Every lesson reinforced the same rule: duty before emotion. There were no carefree mornings, no laughter echoing through halls, no chance to just be children. There was order, there was obedience, and there was an unspoken truth: innocence has an expiration date. George, the eldest, carried the heaviest burden. Catherine's voice faltered as she spoke of him. Once full of wonder, he had grown quiet, thoughtful, worried. He asked questions no child should have to ask. What if I don't want to be king? What if I fail? Palace aides always gave the same answer: destiny is not a choice. Catherine said she had watched her son's laughter fade, replaced by silence only a mother could recognize as fear. Charlotte's struggle was different, fierce and fiery. She pushed back against the rules, questioning everything. Catherine admired her daughter's courage, but feared what it might cost. For every act of defiance came quiet reprimand. For every spark of individuality came a warning: the crown does not bend. Charlotte's spirit, Catherine said, was her salvation and her danger. And then there was Louis, still so young, still innocent enough to believe the world outside the gates was kind. But even he had begun to freeze when the cameras flashed. He didn't understand why strangers shouted his name, why his every move was analyzed. The flashes weren't love to him, they were fear. Catherine's voice cracked. She spoke of watching the light fade from her children's eyes, of realizing one day that laughter no longer echoed through their halls. That silence, that unbearable silence, was what finally broke her. For years, she had told herself it was temporary, that pressure came with the crown. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just pressure. It was something colder, something deliberate. Her words hung heavy in the air. Even the wind seemed to stop. She hinted, in a trembling whisper, that what she had uncovered went far deeper than anyone knew. That behind the polished smiles and perfect portraits, there were practices, rituals, disguised as royal preparation that stripped her children of the one thing she was fighting for: their innocence. This wasn't about duty anymore. It was about survival, But when Catherine revealed what was being done in the name of royal upbringing, the room fell completely silent. Because this time, it wasn't the press or the people she accused, it was the palace itself. Advisors, image makers, senior royals, all complicit in turning children into symbols of obedience. Her voice sharpened, every word hit like truth too long buried. She spoke of a system so tightly controlled that even love was monitored, measured like protocol. Every hour was planned lessons, etiquette, smiles, leaving no room for childhood. She admitted her own affection sometimes felt watched, as if warmth itself was a rule she was not allowed to break. But then came the most chilling revelation: emotional conditioning. The rule passed down through generations. Never cry, never falter, never feel. Her children, she said, were being trained not to feel, but to perform. The crowd finally understood. This wasn't tradition. This was programming. And then came the accusation that sent shockwaves through the kingdom, that the palace advisors had crossed a line. Catherine revealed how she had been told to keep distance, to let her children learn independence by not comforting them, a method that echoed the same cold detachment once inflicted on royal children before them. And it was at that moment that her heartbreak turned into fury. Her voice quivered with quiet strength as she said softly, "A mother should never be told that love can be harmful." The words hung heavy in the air. The pain behind them wasn't just hers, it was centuries old. Catherine spoke not in anger, but in sorrow. Even William, she said, though kind and devoted, had become part of the very system that had once wounded him as a boy. He hadn't meant to. He had simply inherited it, the distance, the discipline, the silence. The crown had shaped him long before love ever had a chance to. Her tone dimmed into something almost mournful. She spoke of how the same institution that molded his childhood was now shaping their own children's lives, and how, without realizing it, history was beginning to repeat itself. "He loves them," she said quietly, "but he's been taught to love them from afar." That single sentence broke something in the room. The crowd went still. The air itself seemed to ache. For the first time, people understood what the crown demanded. Not just loyalty, but separation. A monarchy that asked for devotion in exchange for emotion. Her words darkened as she spoke of how the institution's obsession with control wasn't limited to her family, it was part of its very DNA. For centuries, it had survived by turning love into performance and authenticity into duty. Every generation inherited not only privilege, but pain, trauma disguised as tradition. It was a cycle of sacrifice, affection traded for image, humanity lost to heritage. Catherine lifted her gaze and said firmly, "This isn't preparation for leadership. It's the quiet destruction of childhood." The silence that followed was electric. No one moved. The monarchy, so polished, so proud, suddenly felt fragile, like a fortress built upon the pain it refused to face. Then her voice softened again, trembling yet fierce. "This cycle has already taken too many before." Those words, too, many before, cut through history itself. Everyone in that room felt it. They knew exactly who she meant. Diana. Though Catherine never spoke her name, her presence filled the air. It was as if the late princess had returned through her daughter-in-law's voice. The same defiance, the same heartbreak, the same fierce love for her children that had once shaken the monarchy to its core. History was not just repeating, it was resurrecting. The audience sat frozen. Cameras flashed. But for a moment, it wasn't about royalty. It was about truth echoing through generations. Those who remembered Diana's interview decades earlier could hear it, the same rhythm, the same rebellion, the same cry for compassion. Diana had once said she wanted her sons to grow up with emotion and love, not duty and fear. And now, Catherine, standing in her place, decades later, whispered the same vow: "I will not let them become symbols before they have lived their lives." The words felt prophetic. History had come full circle, but behind the palace walls, her truth struck like thunder. For Prince William, it was unbearable. He saw flashes of his mother, her tears, her warnings, her desperate attempts to protect him and Harry from the cold machinery of the crown. He heard her voice again, warning him, "The system will demand more of you than you can give. Now his wife was standing in that same storm. Across the world, comparisons exploded. Headlines read, "Like mother, like son's wife." Social media was ablaze. Hashtags pairing their names. Photos of Diana holding her sons placed beside Catherine's image as she spoke. It wasn't resemblance in face, it was resemblance in spirit. The same compassion, the same courage, the same refusal to let innocence be consumed by legacy. Global outlets declared. Diana warned them. Catherine proved her right. The palace could feel the ground shifting. What had once been buried was once breathing again. What they had once silenced was now roaring through millions. Commentators called it poetic justice. Inside the palace, they called it something else, a curse reborn. Behind those ancient walls, the monarchy's calm began to crack. Advisors whispered of déjà vu. Catherine had revived something dangerous, empathy. And empathy could not be controlled. They had spent decades rewriting Diana's story, polishing pain into legend. But now that legend had returned in living form, through Catherine's voice, behind closed doors, William's composure finally broke. The cameras never saw it, but those who did said his eyes looked lost, as if he were staring into two timelines, one where he was a boy clutching his mother's hand, and another where he was a husband watching his wife carry her legacy. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was destiny, repeating itself. He tried to stay silent, but silence felt like betrayal. When Catherine spoke the patem, truth, the world cheered. But inside the palace, chaos erupted. Advisors swarmed his study, demanding he issue a counterstatement to deny her claims, to restore the crown's image, to protect tradition. Every word they wrote was polished with diplomacy, but soaked in denial. William couldn't do it. Each time he opened his mouth, he heard his mother's voice again. Never sacrifice truth for duty. It will cost you everything. His silence enraged the courtiers. One whispered that his hesitation was betrayal through stillness. Another warned that by saying nothing, he was letting the monarchy bleed. But William knew to speak against her would be to lose his soul. That night, alone in his private quarters, the dam finally broke. Tears he'd held for decades came flooding back. Not just for Catherine, not just for the crown, but for the boy he once was. The boy who watched his mother's light fade in those same walls. The boy who swore he would never let history repeat, yet now stood watching it unfold again. He pressed his hands to his face and whispered, "Not this time." It was no longer a prince speaking. It was a father making a vow. "Whatever it takes," he whispered, "I'll protect them." It was a promise made not to the crown, but to his children. But promises have consequences. And that vow would soon ignite a new war, not between nations, but within bloodlines. When the king heard Catherine's speech, the temperature inside Buckingham dropped to ice. Charles saw it not as courage, but as rebellion. Camilla saw it as betrayal. In their eyes, the greatest threat to the monarchy was no longer the media, it was Catherine herself. An emergency meeting was called. Senior advisors gathered, pale and panicked. The king's voice cut through the silence. How could this happen? No one answered. They spoke of damage control, restriction, containment. Some suggested removing her from public duties. Others proposed a statement to reassert control. But Charles wanted silence. "She will not speak again," he ordered. Camilla's anger flared hotter than his. "She's using motherhood as a weapon," she said, manipulating sympathy to turn the world against us. To her, Catherine's vulnerability was humiliation, and worse, a threat. She had spent years cementing her place as queen. But in one speech, Catherine had won hearts that no crown could. Soon, the whispers began. Anonymous, sources, questioning her stability, her emotional fitness, her strength. The same tactics once used against Diana, polished and repackaged. But this time, the world was watching. Every attempt to silence her only made her stronger. And then came the confrontation. William burst into his father's study, his calm gone, his voice trembling with rage and pain. "She's protecting our children," he said. "She's endangering the crown," Charles replied coldly. The room crackled with decades of unspoken wounds. Camilla tried to intervene, but William's fury burned through the air. "If you silence her," he warned, "you lose me too." The words fell like prophecy. It wasn't a threat, it was the sound of a lineage breaking. That night, the palace fell into a deceptive silence. But outside, the world had already chosen its side. From London to Los Angeles, millions stood for her. Mothers, fathers, and children held candles in the streets, whispering her words like prayers. Let them be children. Love over legacy. No crown without compassion. It was no longer a royal story. It was a human one. Catherine had become more than a princess. She had become a voice, one that the world would not forget. Catherine's courage had done something few in history ever dared. It gave voice to the voiceless, to every parent who had watched their child suffocate beneath the weight of expectation, to every soul who had once been silenced by power. The world was no longer whispering, it was roaring. What had first been seen as a moment of rebellion was now being called an act of moral bravery. The headlines that once questioned her loyalty now praised her courage. A new era of royal honesty, they wrote. Even media outlets known for their blind devotion to the monarchy began to shift their tone. Catherine had become a mirror, forcing the world to see what the crown had hidden for generations. Political leaders across the globe began to take notice. Some quietly applauded her from the shadows. Others spoke publicly, saying it was time for compassion to rise above protocol. But inside the palace, there was silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than denial. Each day that passed without a royal response only deepened public suspicion. What had once been seen as the dignity of restraint was now being called guilt. The internet exploded. Memes, videos, late-night monologues, all dissecting every look, every unspoken word from the royal family. The narrative was gone. It no longer belonged to the crown. It belonged to the people. And the people had chosen Catherine. Her face appeared on banners, murals, and magazine covers. She was no longer just the Duchess of Cambridge or the future queen consort. She had become something far greater, a symbol of truth against tradition, a heart that beat louder than the crown. Those who once dismissed her as quiet now saw her as a force. The woman who had dared to speak what others only whispered. Her defiance had awakened something powerful, a collective realization that royalty without humanity was nothing but an illusion. And yet, amid all the chaos and global admiration, Catherine herself remained silent, not broken, not defeated, but deliberate. Those close to her said she was preparing for something final. Because while the world was celebrating her bravery, Catherine knew one thing: the fight was far from over. The palace's silence wasn't surrender. It was a storm gathering strength. And when it came, she was ready. As the world held its breath, Catherine stepped once again into the light, not to apologize, but to finish what she had started. Her final appearance wasn't scripted. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, defiant, and filled with grace. Standing before the same palace gates where everything had begun, she made a promise that stopped time itself. With steady eyes and a trembling voice, Catherine declared that her children would never again be sacrificed to the machinery of tradition. The monarchy, she said, would bend or it would break. The crowd erupted. This wasn't a ceremony anymore. It was history. Catherine spoke of her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, not as heirs, but as human beings. They deserved to laugh without fear, she said softly, to grow without expectation, to live without the shadow of duty. There was no diplomacy in her tone, only a mother's truth. And in that moment, the monarchy itself felt small, dwarfed by the sheer power of her love. Then came the vow that changed everything. Catherine announced that her children would no longer participate in public royal duties. No more staged photographs, no more balcony appearances, no more childhoods lived for the camera. Their innocence, she said, is not entertainment. In that single sentence, Catherine shattered the unspoken contract between the crown and the public gaze. She had done what no royal had ever dared, pulled the next generation out of the spotlight. For the first time in living memory, the royal line had stepped away from spectacle. The reaction was instant. Some called her a hero, the woman, who had saved the monarchy from itself. Others accused her of betrayal, claiming she had weakened the very institution she was destined to lead. But no one could deny one thing: she had changed everything. Because this was not evolution, this was revolution. Inside the palace, silence again. No statements, no appearances. Even King Charles remained unseen. His absence said what no press release could, that the crown itself was cracking. Rumors swirled that his fury had reached a breaking point, that his faith in unity had shattered beyond repair. Camilla's influence was questioned. Advisors scrambled to contain the storm, but the world no longer cared for royal statements. Catherine's truth had already won. And then, as if history demanded its final act, William appeared. For days, he had been silent, torn between duty and love, between the crown and his conscience. But when Catherine finished her vow, he stepped forward, his eyes wet with unrestrained emotion. In that moment, the world didn't see a prince. They saw a man, a husband, a father, a son, haunted by his mother's legacy, yet brave enough to rewrite its ending. The cameras caught his tears, and those tears said everything words could not. It was the breaking point the monarchy had long feared, the moment when history turned its page. Catherine's declaration wasn't just rebellion, it was redemption. For Diana, for William, for every child who had grown up in a palace but never known freedom. She had taken the weight of centuries and split it open, revealing the fragile humanity buried beneath. The monarchy, once a fortress of silence, was now forced to face the one truth it had long ignored, that love is the only crown that cannot be taken away. And as the palace lights dimmed that night, one truth lingered in the air: love had triumphed over legacy. And history would never forget the day Catherine chose her children over the crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time for the story behind the crown and the woman who dared to change it forever.